So this morning we're gonna answer the question, what is dementia? And so the first criteria for dementia is that you have to have memory impairment. Memory impairment. And so there's lots of different types of memory. There's long-term memory, short-term memory. There's verbal memory. There's motor memory. So verbal memory might be, for example, people's abilities to remember names and recall recent events. There's memory tasks, such as we'll give people some words to remember, and then we'll distract them with the task, and then we'll go back to the task and ask them what were those words we asked them to remember. Examples of motor memory would be things like, or procedural memory might be things like riding a bicycle, for example. You're even if you haven't ridden a bicycle in years and years and years, chances are you still remember how to do it. And when you hop on the bike, you could still go. So to have dementia, you have to have memory impairment. And even if you don't yet have true impairment, having, and for some dementia types, having decreased memory functioning relative to your previous level of memory functioning could still meet criteria for this sub-criterion. So you don't necessarily have to be severely impaired. Your memory, even though it may essentially be good, if it's worse than it had been, that can still count. So the first criteria is memory impairment. The second criteria to be diagnosed with dementia is you have to have one of these following technical terms. So you have to have aphasia, or Apraxia, or Agnosia, or executive function impairment. And so we can talk about what each of these are and how we test them. And so aphasia is aphasia is a loss of can be thought of as a loss of verbal skills despite having intact verbal mental hardware. So people struggle to speak. It's a speech impairment. And there's different types of aphasia. Most commonly what we'll see is what are called expressive aphasias, which is what I'm doing right now. I'm struggling to get the right words out. And so expressive aphasia might be, examples of an expressive aphasia are, we might show a patient a pen, for example, and we might say, what is this? And the person would, you might say, well, that's a pen. But the person with dementia might say, oh, it's one of those things that you write with. It's like it's a writing instrument. And it's on the tip of my tongue. I just can't get it. They can't get out pen. Or we might say, what is this right here? And they might say, oh, it's a clock. Well, it's not really a clock. It's like a clock. You tell time. And they can't ever get the word watch out. And so we'll ask our patients with dementia to identify different objects to see if we can elicit the aphasias. Another common example where we'll elicit aphasias is to ask them to repeat kind of tricky phrases. And so the one we use most commonly is probably repeat what I say, no ifs, ands, or buts. And the reason we specifically use no ifs, ands, or buts is because ifs, ands, and buts are not commonly thought of as nouns. So we're now using these words that are not, they're usually transitional words. They're not nouns. And so people who have these aphasias, they'll struggle to use these words in this different context. And we'll get answers like no ifs, no ands, or buts, or no if and and but, and they'll just struggle to get the words out. No ifs, ands, or buts. So they're struggling to speak. It's a speech problem, but they're not struggling to speak because because the muscles in their larynx don't work, or because their tongue doesn't work, or because the pathways going to their musculature don't work. They still have intact speech hardware. They just can't get the right words out. So that would be an example of aphasia. For apraxia is where a person has impaired motor abilities despite having intact motor hardware. So similar to aphasia, aphasia is a disorder of speech. Apraxia is a disorder of motor abilities. And so examples where we will test people's motor abilities is we might say, I want you to take this piece of paper in your left hand, I want you to fold it in half, and I want you to put it on the floor. And they'll take it, but they might take it with both hands or the wrong hand, and they'll kind of struggle to fold it in half, and it kind of turns into this mess, and then they might drop it on the floor eventually. But they're just not able to manipulate the object like they once were. Other examples where we'll try and elicit apraxia might be we might ask our patient to show us, I want you to pretend you have a comb in your hand and show me how you would comb your hair. And so someone with apraxia might take their fingers and they might kind of do something like this, where they're showing you how they would comb their hair. But that's not how you would use a comb, right? The way you would use a comb is you would pretend to hold a comb, and you would, in fact, comb your hair like this, right? And so, again, that's an example of apraxia. Agnosia is a person's agnosia is similar to apraxia. Apraxia is a loss of motor functioning. Aphasia is a loss of speech functioning. Agnosia is a loss of sensory functioning. So a person loses their sensory abilities despite having, again, intact sensory hardware. So examples of how we might elicit agnosia would be we might have a person close their eyes, and we might put a paper clip or something in their hands, and we would say, tell us what this is. And they would struggle to identify, in this case, the paper clip. Commonly we'll use paper clips or coins, that kind of thing. But it's not that they can't feel it. They can. So the question isn't, can you feel this? It's not a matter of feeling. It's what is it? Can you identify what this is? Okay, and so that would be an example of agnosia. And then the last is executive function impairment. And so executive function impairment is perhaps the most critical cognitive loss that there could be. And so executive function impairment is your ability to plan, organize, sequence, monitor, and inhibit complex goal-directed behaviors. And so the way that there's different ways to conceptualize this. A synonym might be it's your problem-solving abilities. It's can you solve problems when presented with unique circumstances. And so in a way, it might be you might think of it as problem-solving abilities. Other people might think of it as it's kind of related to judgment or insight. And so regardless, it's all of that. It's your frontal lobe functioning is what it is. And so the way that with my medical students, the way I'll explain executive function is that it's your ability. It's the set of cognitive processes that allows you to behave independently from your environment, instead of having the environment mediate your behaviors. And so you don't want the environment to control how you behave. And so we can think of different examples of executive function impairment in elders. And so driving is probably a great example. And so you can imagine with driving, there's you have to plan, organize, sequence. You can just think of all the cognitive abilities it takes to, for example, drive a car. And what will happen when people become executively impaired is they become dependent on habit, and they become dependent on routine. And all of a sudden, their environment will start to control their behaviors. And so we can think of driving as an example, such that you'll hear on the news, for example, that someone was intoxicated with alcohol and they hit a pole, or they're intoxicated with alcohol. And you'll hear about police officers who've pulled someone else over and the police officer's car gets hit. Or they hit a tree, they hit some object. And what happens, again, when people become intoxicated with alcohol is that they become executively impaired. Their frontal lobe ceases to work, and they become attracted to whatever the strongest signals are in their environment. And so you can imagine if a police officer has pulled a person over and the lights are flashing and the blinkers are blinking and there's this big scene, then that scene becomes the strongest stimulus in the field. And then if someone's intoxicated coming up, they'll just drive right into that stimulus. Similarly, there'll be stretches of highway out in West Texas where there is no trees for miles, and yet someone will become intoxicated and hit that tree. And you'll say, man, what are the odds of someone hitting that one tree, right? And what happens, though, is that people become attracted to the strongest stimulus in the field. In this case, it's a tree, and the tree is just calling to them, and they just hit the tree. And so that's an example of how when people become executively impaired, their environment is mediating their behaviors. Similarly, in nursing homes, a big challenge would be wandering behaviors. And so we can use a nursing home example of doors with doorknobs. And so what will happen is people will walk up to the door, and there's a doorknob, and the doorknob is just calling them, saying, turn me. And so they just turn the doorknob, and they walk through the door. And again, they're just defaulting to their habits, and the environment is dictating their behaviors. Cooking might be another example where you can imagine that if someone is in their kitchen and they're cooking a dish that they've always cooked before, as long as there's no interruptions, then things usually go fine. Every single time, things will always go fine. However, in executively impaired people, if there's an interruption, if the routine is broken, and the person has to step away, for example, maybe the phone rings and they step away and then they come back. It's not that they've forgotten how to make the recipe. They just can't reset, reorganize. They don't have the ability to monitor what they've been doing, and that's when disasters happen. That's when accidents happen in the kitchen. So these are examples of executive impairment, executive function impairment. Again, you can kind of think of it as problem-solving type abilities. And so, again, to be demented, you have to have memory impairment, and then you have to have one of these other four cognitive losses, either aphasia, apraxia, agnosia, or executive function impairment. And then finally, you have to have functional impairments, functional decline. And so functional decline is just that. It's you are no longer able to do the things that you used to do. You're no longer able to meet your self-care activities, your self-care needs. And so these are things like higher order examples of functional decline might be things like using the telephone, managing your money, managing your medications, driving or arranging for transportation. Those would be higher order levels of functional loss. And then more basic functional loss would be things like walking, toileting, grooming, showering, these kinds of things. And so, in general, when we think about functional loss is what ultimately predicts the level of care that people need. And so when people lose their higher order functional abilities, and these are things like telephone, their ability to use a telephone, manage their money, manage their medications, arrange for transportation, housekeeping. When they lose higher order functional abilities, then what they need is an assisted living level of care. That's when people will need an assisted living level of care. When they lose the basics, their ability to groom themselves, bathe, shower, ambulate safely, and toileting, then that's when they need a nursing home level of care. And so what predicts the level of care isn't so much cognitive loss, it's functional loss. Okay? And so this is the textbook definition of dementia.